Okay. Right, so I want to talk for the next half hour or so, and again to leave some time at the end for discussion, about the ethics of Jesus and how we should approach and begin to try and make sense of Jesus' ethical teaching. By the ethics of Jesus, I mean that part of Jesus' teaching that was specifically concerned with human conduct or behaviour, with how people should live. Of course, the vast majority of Jesus' teaching was like that, but I guess there are things he talked about as well that were not directly related to human conduct. But the ethics of Jesus is the teaching that is specifically addressed to the question of how people ought to live and act. There is, of course, a huge amount of ethical material in the Gospel narratives, and the best known and undoubtedly the most important and most challenging section is the so-called Sermon on the Mount, which runs from Matthew chapter 5 through to chapter 7. It's generally regarded as the showpiece of Jesus' ethical instruction, the purest, the clearest, the most inspiring, the most characteristic expression of his moral perspective. Jesus was, of course, justly famous as a moral or ethical teacher. He is esteemed as one of the great moralists of all times. If you were to go down the street and ask people what they thought about Jesus, I can guarantee that many people would say he was a great teacher. Just be a kind of default position. That's interesting. What did he teach? Well, I'm not sure, but he was a great teacher. He was actually, that's the way that we remember him. They probably wouldn't say he was a great prophet or he was a great Messiah, but he was a great teacher. And his teachings, of course, are widely respected by those who do read them and know a little bit about them, even by non-Christians. The great Hindu leader Mahatma Gandhi, for example, who was a great fan of Jesus, although he was a Hindu all his life, described the Sermon on the Mount as the world's finest collection of ethical teaching. Gandhi once observed, and these are his words, "The only people on earth who do not see Christ and his teaching as non-violent are Christians." Although a Hindu, as I said, was captivated by the person and teaching of Jesus, and Gandhi himself has been described as one of the most Christ-like of men in history. The great Christian missionary theologian in India, E. Stanley Jones, was a personal friend of Gandhi, and he writes of Gandhi, "I bow to Mahatma Gandhi and I kneel at the feet of Christ. A little man," this is Gandhi, "who has taught me more of the Spirit of Christ than perhaps any man in East or West." So Gandhi himself was obviously a very saintly, though flawed person, but he was a tremendous fan of Jesus, and he was a great fan of the scriptures of all religious traditions. He knew them all, but he loved the Sermon on the Mount. Or the Jewish scholar Pinchas Lapid refers to the Sermon on the Mount as the quintessence, it means the finest expression of Judaism, the original creation of one of the great luminaries of human history. Christian writers as well, of course, share this estimate. One describes the Sermon on the Mount as the loftiest ideal for human conduct ever conceived. Now, given its beliefs about Jesus, you would think that the Christian community would consider itself obligated to take Jesus' ethical teaching as an authoritative guide for how it's to conduct itself in the world. You'd expect that to be the case, given what we believe about Jesus and who he is. You'd think we would feel a sense of obligation to take his teaching very seriously. But we do, I think, at this point strike a very strange anomaly, which is, despite its beliefs about Jesus' historical teaching has all but been ignored by the Christian church. That's perhaps a bit too strong, but it's not entirely overstated. At a practical level, the Christian church as an institution, historically, has often failed lamentably to live up to the standards that Jesus taught, and at its worst has devised all kinds of ways of evading or domesticating or denying his words. But even at a theoretical level, Jesus' most radical teachings play remarkably little role in standard textbooks on Christian ethics, at least until recently. Christian moral philosophy arguably owes more to the Greek concept of natural law than it does to the teaching of Jesus. It wouldn't be impossible to go and look up texts on Christian moral philosophy and go to an index and just see how many times the Gospels are cited, and you'd probably find they're hardly ever cited. And I would suggest, and here I'm going to show my own theological colours and prejudices, but I would suggest that it's the church's disregard for the teaching of Jesus that has allowed it to bear the name of Christ and to do the work of the devil at one and the same time. Claiming to follow Jesus, claiming to embody the call of Jesus, the institutional church has through the centuries amassed wealth, waged war, tortured dissenters, murdered Jews, burned witches, and we sort of think the idea of witches is kind of comical, but there were episodes in the Middle Ages where 600 young women would have been burnt as witches. Has oppressed and abused the poor and the weak, and still claimed to represent Christ in the world. Surely it's only possible for the church to have done that because it has first managed to silence the moral voice of Jesus, to not listen to the things that Jesus says. Now, thankfully, we don't burn witches anymore. But the tendency to silence the moral voice of Jesus is one that we still, I think, struggle with. We still muzzle the voice of Jesus on many issues, not on all issues, but arguably on those issues that matter most. Issues to do with wealth and power and violence and justice and prejudice. We so often fail to really take Jesus seriously. Why do we? Why is it so difficult for us to take the moral teaching of Jesus with the kind of seriousness it requires? Especially given how at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus issues this very solemn warning. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only those who do the will of my Father in heaven. On that day, this is the day of judgment, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many miracles in your name? And I will declare to them, sorry, I don't know you. Go away from me, you evildoers. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and the house stood. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew, beat against the house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Here Jesus is saying that claiming allegiance to Jesus, prophesying in the name of Jesus, working miracles, even driving out demons is simply not good enough. Only those who hear and do these words of mine, which in context is the previous 3 chapters of the Sermon on the Mount. This is the end of Matthew 7. Only those who hear and do these words are assured of a welcome into God's kingdom. So why is it that for generations Christians have found it so difficult to take Jesus seriously? Why has Jesus' moral perspective been at best marginalised and at worst totally rejected and repudiated by those who claim to follow him? Well, no doubt a large part of the answer is the reality of human pride and sinfulness. To take Jesus seriously requires moral self-criticism. Jesus has an uncanny habit of making us feel very uncomfortable. Me too. I mean, this is, in fact, you could almost suggest that if you read the Gospels and you don't come away feeling uncomfortable, you probably haven't been listening, because, you know, he just is so searching in his demands. And so, because we're all sinful and because we're all proud, we shelter ourselves from the uncomfortable search of Jesus' light. But there's perhaps more to it than that as well, because any attempt to take ancient ethical teaching and to apply it to present life, whether it's our personal life or our communal life or our society's life, any attempt to take a series of statements from the first century and to use it as a way of thinking about, you know, the economic system or the justice system or whatever in our society today, faces a range of hermeneutical difficulties. Now that word, big ugly word, it just means problems of interpretation, problems of actually knowing how to interpret and apply this stuff appropriately. Now there's no time to explore all these problems, but let me just mention what some of them are. And again, this is all just really, I think, telling you what you already know, but perhaps it's helpful to put some labels around it. One of the problems we face is the problem of historical and cultural distance. How can teaching that was addressed by Jesus to small-town, pre-modern Jewish peasant society possibly be relevant to postmodern 21st century industrial, commercial, technocratic, global society? I mean, how can this sort of hippie character in rural Palestine possibly have anything to say to the world in which we live in? It's such a different world. Just to give you one example, Jesus often condemns in his teaching and in his parables the storing up of wealth. Remember the parable of Mr. Bigger Barns, who had bumper crops and he just kept putting in the barns, just kept banking it. And then he died. You fool! You know, you should have been rich towards God, not putting in more barns. You should have actually been giving it to others. Now, do we say, well, Jesus is opposed to storing up wealth? Well, our society depends upon storing up wealth. This church wouldn't be here if somebody hadn't stored up wealth. You know, we live in a society where we just operate with numbers that need to be stored up in banks and so on. So, how do we make a kind of statement that refers to the way in which accumulation of wealth in a peasant society betokened greed and selfishness? How do we make that apply to a society where the accumulation of wealth is actually integral to the way the whole economic system operates? It's not always automatically greedy to store up wealth. It's sensible, it's necessary, it's required even. So we face the problem of crossing this great cultural and historical gap. And then there's the problem of translating Jesus' really colourful style of teaching into sort of workable ethical guidelines. Jesus makes extensive use of figurative language, of vivid imagery, of striking metaphors, of ludicrous exaggeration. Jesus said things that once you've heard them, you'll never forget them. Camels going through the eye of a needle, taking a log out of your eye so you can see a speck in your brother or sister's eye, cutting off a limb if it offends you, gouging out your eye if it encourages you to lust after something you shouldn't have, forgiving a wrongdoer 77 times every day, stripping naked if somebody demands your garment, giving the second garment so you've got nothing left. I mean, very vivid, dramatic, colourful language that Jesus uses. Well, how do we translate that into workable moral principles and guidelines that can work today? It's a challenge. Or another one, the problem of avoiding a kind of legalistic moralism. If we treat Jesus' moral demands with utmost seriousness, how do we avoid turning ourselves into stultifying, oppressive moralists who are always telling people where they're wrong and always feeling either right or wrong yourself. It's commonly happened in traditions that have strongly emphasized the importance of moral law or divine law. But how do you avoid it? How do you take Jesus seriously without becoming, I hesitate to say it, without becoming a Pharisee, without becoming the kind of self-righteous, bombastic person that Jesus so disliked? Well, they're all questions that you can lie awake and worry about tonight, and I can't give you the answers. But I would like to just make some comments on 4 more general hermeneutical questions. And I hope these are all helpful, just as, again, highlighting perhaps mistakes that we can easily make when we consult the Gospels for guidance. One good reason for avoiding legalism or moralism is that it is very unlikely that Jesus was ever intending to lay down a new moral law or a new moral code. He makes very little use of legal language. The legal language of the day is, if such and such a thing happens, then this is what you must do. The if-then kind of language. Very, very rare in Jesus' teaching. He doesn't, as the Pharisees did, devise systems of detailed rules and regulations to cover every possible exigency that you might face in life. Instead, most of Jesus' teaching concerns attitudes and motivations and intentions, which are not actually amenable to legislative control. You can't pass a law against anxiety or against anger or against unforgiveness. You can't legislate for generosity or humility or trust. These aren't the sort of things that you can turn into rules. And yet those are the sorts of things that Jesus tends to speak a lot about. His teaching is very spontaneous rather than systematic. And most importantly, his teaching is not comprehensive. It doesn't cover every issue that you might worry about. And he doesn't, even the issues he does talk about, he doesn't cover very thoroughly in great detail. Because he's not concerned to lay out a kind of ethical or legal system, but rather what I think he's trying to do is challenge his hearers to a kind of new level of moral awareness, a kind of set of moral instincts, a set of moral virtues. There's a lot of talk today in ethics about virtue ethics, about the importance of creating virtuous people. A virtuous person doesn't need to have rules to follow. They kind of are in their character formed according to things like trust and faithfulness and humility and integrity. These are things that shape character. And a virtuous person lives out of their character, not out of just following the rules. If you just follow the rules, you're liable to become moralistic or legalistic. But if you are seeking to be a particular kind of person, then you're protected more from that danger. And I think a lot of Jesus' teaching was calling people to a sort of set of moral sensitivities, to a set of moral instincts, to a set of moral priorities, to virtues, to being particular kind of people. And it's the sort of thing that we learn from, often not from imbibing moral or legal codes. We often learn virtue by witnessing virtuous people. We often, I think, learn our virtues by seeing other people embodying it. And of course the disciples saw it embodied in Jesus, and he was calling them to embody it in their own lives. So to turn Jesus' teaching into some kind of rigid legal code, not only, I think, does violence to Jesus' intention, but it also short-circuits the whole difficult task of being a good person. You know, it's much easier to follow the rules than to be morally transformed. Much easier just to sort of obey a set of abstract or a set of moral directives than it is to do the hard work of being transformed in your character to become a more godly person. And I think Jesus' teaching is a call, I guess you could say it's a call to godliness, it's a call to virtue. It's not a rules-based sort of approach. And I mean, it just pops into my mind, one area where this, I think, has played itself out in a number of churches is to do with divorce. I mean, we all know that in Jesus' teaching, he rules out divorce. And that in many conservative churches in particular, but in fact in the church generally until a generation ago, was taken to be a kind of moral absolute. That if you divorced for any reason other than, because Matthew has this exception, other than unchastity or immorality of some kind, then if you divorced for any other reason, then there was no possibility of remarriage. And it was turned into a kind of rigid rule. Rather than asking, well, what is Jesus really talking about here? Surely he's talking about the nature of the commitment of marriage. He's talking about faithfulness. He's talking about being committed to the relationship. He's not sort of laying down rules about when divorce is appropriate, when it's not appropriate. If we turn it into a rules-based thing, I think we lose. We assume that Jesus is attempting to be comprehensive about everything you need to know about divorce, rather than actually thinking in terms of the kind of people that he's trying to create. So I think his teaching is best understood as representative sort of examples of virtue. That's probably all a bit mumbled and jumbled. It's sort of pouring out my mouth as I talk, but I hope you get the picture. Secondly, it's often been assumed that, and this is, I would suggest to you, one of the ways in which we've managed to silence Jesus in the church, is to assume that Jesus is only talking about personal ethics, but he's not talking about social ethics. In other words, he's talking about how individuals should live, but he's not really ever talking about how society should operate. And I have a number of quotes in my notes which I won't read out to you, where scholars basically say that Jesus is not concerned about social or political reform. He's concerned about individuals' relationship with each other and with God. And there is some truth to that. Jesus, because he is so concerned about motivations and intentions and virtues, does talk about individual conduct a lot. And he doesn't really talk about the great social institutions like the government or the courts or the schools or the military or businesses, how they ought to operate. And Jesus didn't occupy a political office. He didn't have any authority to legislate on societal issues. He addressed himself, as we've seen over and over again, to the little people who had no social power, the poor. They couldn't decide how society ought to operate. So there is truth about that. But that doesn't mean that Jesus had no interest in what we today would call social issues. On the contrary, I think Jesus' teaching has real social significance. And it becomes, I think, apparent if you just take these three observations into account. First of all, people in Jesus' day lacked the kind of excessive individualism that we take for granted in modern Western society. We, and this is increasingly true, very much think of human beings as isolated individuals who sort of contract to live together in society. We sort of form agreements with each other in order to live together in society. But in biblical understanding and in most non-Western world, that's probably an exaggeration, but in many non-Western societies, there's, I think, a much greater recognition that our individual identity actually derives from our relationships with the community. That we can't be human on our own. We derive our sense of human identity from the communities and solidarities that we belong to. I remember reading in a Time magazine 30 years ago a Japanese businessman who said, in the West you say, I'm okay, you're okay. There was a book, that title published a number of years ago, Western View, I'm okay, you're okay. He said, in Japan we say, we're okay, I'm okay. I think Maori society would say that as well. We're okay, therefore I'm okay. My sense of being all right derives from the fact that the community to which I belong is all right. And I think this is the sort of worldview that Jesus took for granted. The whole distinction between personal ethics and social ethics is actually quite misleading. Moral formation of individuals always takes place in communities. Personal ethics derives from the shared moral traditions of the wider society, the wider community. Especially true of Jewish ethics, biblical ethics. They were addressed to the covenant community of Israel, and they applied to individuals insofar as they were members of that community. Which means that even if Jesus did address himself to individual conduct, he was at the same time addressing society as a whole, because the two really couldn't be separated. He aimed at the renewal of individual experience, certainly, but also at social experience as well. We also need to remember that the religious leaders that Jesus engaged with also exercised political power. The law of Moses was the law of the land, if you like. The temple was not only the spiritual centre of the nation, it was also the powerhouse of the Jerusalem economy, and it was a seat of government. The Messiah was a political figure as well as a religious figure. The kingdom of God is a political category. We've seen this. So when Jesus confronted the religious establishment with the call of the kingdom, he was addressing social realities, not just personal issues. He was addressing social and political realities. He was challenging the way that those in positions of power exercise their power in the wider community, which is why, excuse me, which is why Jesus got killed. I think I may have mentioned in the first one of the lectures that when historical Jesus scholars try to come up with criteria for identifying historically reliable material in the Gospels, many of them have recently used the criterion of crucifiability, which is that any reconstruction of the historical ministry of Jesus will only be credible if it explains why Jesus got crucified. And Jesus was crucified because he was perceived to be a threat to the reigning priests of the temple state of Judea and to the Roman overlords. It wasn't the little people that crucified Jesus, it was the power brokers. Why did they crucify Jesus? Because they were threatened. Why were they threatened? Because what he said had a bearing on social justice issues, had a bearing on the way they exercised power. If Jesus was only concerned about creating isolated saints who prayed more and were nicer to their pets and so on, Jesus would have been given an award. He would not have been crucified. The fact that he was crucified was a sign that his teaching was perceived rightly to be actually a threat to the existing order of society at large. And my third observation would be that when you look carefully at Jesus' actual teaching, it addresses at least 4 central features of social life. And they are these: the existence of prejudice, the use of material wealth, the exercise of coercive political power, and the use of violence. And arguably, those 4 themes dominate the teaching, the ethical teaching of Jesus. So what Jesus had to say about each of those issues: prejudice, wealth, power, and violence. But he said all those things had obvious social and economic implications. So Jesus called for social change as well as personal change. The key question is, how did Jesus envisage this social change actually occurring? What strategy did he have for accomplishing the transformation of society and institutional renewal? And I would argue that, I'm sorry for these are not really very helpful headings. I would argue that his primary strategy, and I would suggest it's probably still God's primary strategy for social transformation, is the creation of a dissident community that seeks to shape its life according to the call of the kingdom in the midst of larger social reality. That the way in which the kingdom challenged the issues of society in Jesus' day was through the existence of this community of disciples who lived according to a different drumbeat. And I think that remains God's primary strategy for change. We have been through a period in Western history called Christendom, when the church has exercised considerable social and even political power in society. That has come to an end. Thank the Lord. Because that has, I think, been our undoing as the representatives of God's new world in the midst of the old. And we are now, I think, at a time when we can find our true role in society, which is as a dissident community of love that lives according to a different kind of drumbeat and doesn't seek to achieve its goals through controlling power or controlling the purse strings. And I think this was Jesus' strategy in his own day, and it remains his strategy today. I'm going to stop because I have more to say, but I think probably we should stop and just have some discussion. By ecclesial or worldly ethics, what I was wanting to say there is that although Jesus' strategy was to create this dissident community of love in the midst of wider society, his teaching was not solely concerned with the well-being of this community. It wasn't ecclesial ethics in the sense that it was a kind of segregated community and that Jesus was only concerned about creating a holy huddle. But nor was Jesus teaching worldly ethics in some general sense. He wasn't teaching sort of how the whole world is supposed to organise itself. Instead, he was teaching his community how to be a microcosm of the kingdom, and when it lived as a microcosm of the kingdom, it could invite the world to move in our direction, if you like. But it would take me probably another 15 minutes to explain that, so I'm going to stop. Right, any comments or questions? Yes?
Do you have any comments to make about Jesus' ethical teaching with related to Paul's teaching of justification like that?
Are you thinking of the question of whether we are saved by what we do or saved by our faith in Christ?
Yeah, I mean, I'll sit on now,
Yeah. You asked me to do this. The question is, what's the relationship between the ethical teaching of Jesus and Paul's teaching of justification by faith? Jesus appears to be saying, in the parable at the end of Matthew 7 there, that the only ones who will be welcomed into the kingdom are those who do my words. Paul has been understood to be saying we're not saved by what we do, we're saved by the simple act of trust in the gospel. And that's your question, I think. Yeah, more or less. What's the easiest way to try and tell you how I think about this? I guess I would put it this way. I think we are not saved by saved I mean participate in God's sort of great clean-up operation, be part of the kingdom, however you want to, whatever language you want to use, let's just call it saved. We're not saved by works in the sense that we can achieve our own liberation, or that we can fix the problem ourselves, or that we can ever do enough to merit God's grace towards us. So we're not saved by works in the sense that we have the power to do it ourselves. We are saved by trusting in what God has done for us, and that's grace. But that doesn't mean that we don't do anything. or that we can get away with not doing anything. And I don't think Paul ever meant that, when he said you're not saved by works of the law, that means you're not therefore obligated to do anything. I think it's more the former. You're not saved by the fact that through steadfast commitment to the law you can fix the problem. You can't. The law is part of the problem. It's not going to. It's not. So it's not. I guess you could say we're not saved by works, but we're never saved without works either. And the great verse in Ephesians where it talks about, I should look that up because I won't be able to quote. Anybody got a Bible? I never bring a Bible. Often, thank you. There's a verse that's often quoted as a kind of crystallizing Paul's understanding of justification by faith and not by works, but we tend to only read the first half of it. In Ephesians, see if I can find it now, Ephesians 2, is it? Ephesians 2. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not the result of works that anyone may boast. Know that verse? Often there it says it in a verse. But the very next verse said, for we are what he has made us, created in Christ Jesus for good works. So the first part says we're not saved by works because then we could boast in the fact that we fixed the problem, but we're saved for good works. So if we don't do good works, we're not proving the salvation we've received, therefore we're not saved. So I think that the faith and works thing can't be separated. It's just understanding what role works play. Is that helpful? Is it right? I think it's really... I think if we read the Gospels with the kind of standard Protestant idea of saved by faith and not by works, we actually miss most of the demand of Jesus over and over again. Like I've been working on the parable of the Good Samaritan. There's this debate with the lawyer. Lawyer says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life? What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus doesn't say, "Wrong question. You're saved by faith, not by works." Jesus says to him, well, what does the scripture say? How do you read it? Well, it says, I must love the Lord my God with all my heart and soul and mind and strength, and my neighbour as myself. Jesus says, right answer, do this and you will live. Do. And then at the very end of the parable of the Sermon on the Mount, go you and do likewise. And that's over and over again. It's what you do. It's the way you live. It's the works you do. But if we think that by doing it we have somehow merited or achieved the solution to the world's problems, then we're wrong. But I think we've just got to not filter all this out by a kind of half-pied understanding of justification by faith. Any other questions? Yes?
We have this very strong drive against morality and salvation. Is it come from motivation or it's very strong?
Yeah. Question is, where does this strong personal morality, personal salvation idea come from? Well, I don't know. I'm not a historian, so I don't really know. But here's just, I guess, my intuition. There is an important sense, and you find this in the teaching of Jesus as well. There is an important sense in which he addresses himself to individuals. The story of the woman with the hemorrhage, for example, who reaches out and touches Jesus and is healed, and he says to her, "Your faith has saved you." There, your faith has saved you. And it's personal. It's personal pronouns. So there is a real individualism in Jesus' encounter with people. And I think the reason for it is because it's not coercive. Jesus was always inviting. And people could respond to his invitation freely as individuals. It wasn't, you've got to follow the crowd, or you've just got to, sort of bear the fate of the community. It's always invitational and non-coercive. So there is a real individualism in the teaching of Jesus. But I think we increasingly, in sort of post-Enlightenment society, we have become so individualistic. I think we've lost touch with the extent to which there is a communal, corporate reality that Jesus just takes for granted. And I think we've lost touch with that. And we've also, and perhaps a bigger problem, is that we've become fixated with the idea that it's my post-mortem security that's always at stake. That it's whether I'm going to go to heaven or not. And when the gospel is reduced to the fact, well, if you say the right things or believe the right things, you can be sure that you'll be in the green queue on Judgment Day rather than the red queue. You know how you go through the airport. Anything to declare. To be sure that you're in the right saved community, people are very, very fixated on that, rather than the idea that we're called to be part of this renewing work of God in the world that will spill over to the other world, but is actually taking place here on earth. And the call to faith is a call to individually agree to join in this restorative movement. So it's individual, but it's not individualistic. Well, what is it that Jim Wallace says? Andrew Bradstock always quotes him, that the gospel is always personal, but it's never private. I think that's the way he puts it. It's always personal, but it's never private. It applies to individuals personally, and it requires a personal, volitional, free, loving response. But it's not just about private experience or about personal, individual reality. Ross.
How helpful do you think codes of ethics are generally?
Yeah. The question is how helpful are codes of ethics? Well, I think they're very helpful and they're very necessary, because a code of ethics, there's a kind of objectivity about it. This is the kind of principles that we as a community have come to acknowledge are important, apart from the sort of the fluctuations of individual experience or individual insight. So codes of ethics are important. I think we do need moral rules, we do need guidelines, we do need principles, we do need to sort of state what we aspire to and what we consider to be wrong. But it's not enough. You can't. I guess you could say, and I guess I'm freewheeling here again. I guess you could say that moral codes are kind of shorthand way of describing moral character. And the most important thing is the development of moral character. It's not simply formally obeying the codes of rules, but I think we do need those codes. Thou shalt not kill, I think, is important for us to hear. I always remember seeing a film years ago. It was an anti-nuclear film, and I remember a Catholic bishop saying, "It is a sin to build a nuclear weapon." I remember thinking how powerful that is. It's called a sin to build a nuclear weapon. Whether you agree with it or not, I happen to agree with it, but even if you don't, it's a very powerful way of affirming a moral principle, that to build a weapon that can kill indiscriminately is wrong. To hear that as a moral code is important, because different people will come up with different views about it. So I think those sort of principles and codes are still important. But that's the easy part in some ways. The hard part is being a loving person, isn't it? That's the hard thing, and that requires a commitment to virtue and to transformation. That is what I think Jesus is constantly calling to. Yes.
The question is related to the moral codes and ethics. With the death and resurrection of Christ, the Mosaic law came to an end. And Mosaic law has 630 laws, of which the best known are the Ten Commandments.
Yep.
Why is there such fixation with the Ten Commandments? Christianity. Whereas the Mosaic law has come to an end and Christ gave us a new command.
Yes, well, the question is, sorry, I have to repeat the question so that people can hear it. The question is, if it's true that with the coming of Christ, Mosaic law comes to an end, and Mosaic law includes the Ten Commandments, why are Christians so hung up on the Ten Commandments? That's the question, rather than the new commandment, which is to love one another. It is a very big question, and there's a lot of things there to reflect on. Paul does say in Romans 10 that the law reaches its end with the coming of Christ. The word is telos. But it's not clear whether he means by that it reaches its goal or that it comes to a complete end in some kind of termination sense. The word can mean both of those things. So Paul could mean that the law now reaches its fulfillment, its goal, with the coming of Christ. Not that the law ceases to have any kind of continuing role or authority or significance for the Christian era. And indeed, it continues to have that. And Paul himself quotes the laws. I mean, sums up the law in terms of love of neighbour, and the whole law is fulfilled in this one word, he says in Romans. So the law doesn't come to an end in the sense that it becomes irrelevant. It comes to an end in the sense that the period in which our relationship to God and our knowledge of God was controlled by the Mosaic Torah has now been superseded by the work of Christ. So the law kind of moves to the side of the stage. I sometimes tell students it's a little bit like a play in which the protagonist, the chief hero, only appears in Act 3. And when the hero appears in Act 3, the person that you thought was the most important person suddenly sort of falls into the background. That's how I think Paul thinks of the law. The Torah was the centre of everything until Christ came, and then the Torah sort of takes a step backwards. And now the centre is Christ. But the law is still there. It's still on stage. It still speaks. It's still Paul says it's holy, just and good in Romans 7. But the rule of the law comes to an end, and the condemnation of the law comes to an end, and the priority of the law comes to an end. All that is now taken over by the person of Christ. So rather than, I think, saying that the law is ended so we no longer have anything to do with it, I think it's more a way of thinking, how is the law transformed by the coming of Christ? And if I had I do have a whiteboard. That's pretty good. There's a very simple diagram which here's the law. It's called the law of Moses. And here's the era of the church. And in between us is the reality of Christ. It's Christ that is the difference between what came before and the world that we live in. Some aspects of the law do come to an end. So there's no more sacrifice. We're no longer accountable to purity laws or to food laws or to circumcision. This is the great issue that Paul struggles with. Some of those regulations do actually terminate. And even some of the moral regulations, according to Jesus, terminate. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, turn the other cheek, go the second mile. Give to the person who confiscates your goods. And I think that's one of the things that Jesus says, in a sense, comes to an end. Other things don't actually change at all. Ten Commandments say, don't commit adultery. Jesus says, don't commit adultery. In fact, don't even commit adultery. Don't even think about committing adultery. The law says, don't steal. Jesus says, don't steal. The law says, don't lie. Jesus says, don't lie. So some things continue on. And other things, I think, are transformed. and they take on a different kind of shape. So there's a tremendous emphasis in the New Testament on purity, but it's a kind of moral purity rather than a ritual purity. So the laws of purity are kind of transformed by the reality of Christ. So standing at this side of the resurrection, reading the Old Testament and the law, here's a little rule of thumb for you. Never apply anything you read in the Old Testament to today without first asking, what difference does Jesus make? What difference does Jesus make? Sometimes Jesus doesn't make any difference. Sometimes he makes it a darn sight harder. And sometimes it makes a radical difference. You have heard that it was said, you know, love your friends and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies. You've heard that it was said, you shall not murder. But I say to you, if you're even angry with your brother, you've already nurtured the sin in your heart. So what difference does Jesus make? That, I think, is a more helpful way of thinking about it. But just to come to your final point, I agree with you. I don't think as Christians we should be talking about the Ten Commandments. We should be talking about the Sermon on the Mount. We should be talking about the Beatitudes. I mean, not that the Ten Commandments aren't important, but some of the Ten Commandments, like the Sabbath day and so on, are things that are transformed in the new era. The charter of the kingdom, I think, is really, blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are the peacemakers. Yes?
But what would Jesus mean when he says, not a stroke of the letter of the Lord shall pass away?
Until all is fulfilled, until all is accomplished. And he began his ministry by saying, the time is fulfilled. The kingdom of God is at hand. So another saying, he says, the law and the prophets were until John the Baptist. Since then, the good news of the gospel has been proclaimed. So when he says not a jot or tittle of the law will pass away, he means that the law stands as the unchangeable expression of God's will until the time of its fulfillment occurs. And the time of its fulfillment is the time of the kingdom, the time of the proclamation of Jesus. So if we took it just at face value, nothing in the law ever changes, then how do we make sense of what Paul does with circumcision and with us, Sabbath observance and so on? Things do change. But it's not that they have been abolished. I don't think I've come to abolish the law. I haven't come to abolish, I've come to fulfill. And the fulfillment is this set of transformations, how things look different because of Jesus. And so the rest of Matthew 5, just following that text, is example of what this means. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. That's the transformation. That's the change, the difference that Jesus makes.
This might be a big question, but is it possible for an institution to be Christ-like or to be a Christ follower and institutions? Because they all seem to be
Yeah. That's a very profound question. Is it possible? The question was: is it possible for institutions to be Christ-like? In this work the book I've just finished, I asked that question in slightly different ways. I ask: is it possible for institutions to be compassionate? Because it's a book about compassion. But it's the same kind of question. I mean, there is something about compassion that's personal, it's voluntary, that's individual, that's moral, and those sort of things don't apply to institutions or to structures. But we all know that it's possible for institutions to be cruel. So surely it's possible for institutions to be compassionate, not by feeling compassion, but by seeking to observe the obligations of compassion in the way they operate, seeking to put the priorities of compassion to work, seeking to have compassionate people involved. And I guess you could apply the same way of thinking about Christ-likeness. Is it possible for the police force to be Christ-like? Fiona? Is it? Well, in one sense you have to say no, not in the sense that Jesus calls his followers to a non-coercive way of operating, and the police force is inherently coercive. But you could say that we could call the police force to at least seek to move in the direction of Jesus. And that's how I understand Christian ethics, really, is primarily saying this is how we as the confessing community should try to live, and we invite society to move in this direction, knowing that you'll never get there. Gosh, we can't even get there. But you'll never be able to get as far as the church can, but you can at least try and move in that direction. Desmond Tutu used to say, in the struggle against apartheid, he used to say to the South African government, we're being nice to you, we're inviting you to come and join the winning side, because you're backing something that is destined to crumble because it's unjust. So why don't you just wake up to the fact that you're going to go down in a pile of dust and come and join the winning side? In a sense, I think that's what Christian ethics is. It's primarily talking about how we, as the followers of Jesus, should try to live, but also asking for the structures, the institutions of society to try and move in that direction as best they can. And of course, they can't in the same sense because of the nature of social life. Yeah.
How do you bring that down? In fact, say I was walking down the street and I see a girl, someone would be attempting to rape someone. A love response wouldn't be to be non-coercive, would it?
No. But, I mean, it's a good example, really. I mean, let's just assume, that, for starters, that Jesus, and I mean, most Christians would accept this, I'm sure, Augustine certainly did, that Christians should not use violence for personal, even self-defence. I mean, that Augustine thought that was not right. It was always for the defence of the neighbour. So let's just assume that Christian ethics is one that calls us to a position of non-violence, which I happen to believe in, but others don't necessarily agree. And then we encounter a situation where we need to use violence or force in order to defend somebody from being hurt. I think what Christians should do is to firstly challenge the idea that violence is always required and the only way to respond, and seek creative ways to achieve the goal of protection, but ways that look more like Jesus. Right? And there's some wonderful stories. I mean, I'll finish with this story because time is going, and you probably don't want to slip out while I'm still speaking. But there is a story of a woman who tells of waking up one night in her apartment, an American woman, to find an intruder in her bedroom. And she was a person who was very committed to non-violence. And so she faced this challenge of, what do I do? Here's somebody in my apartment. And she chose to try and respond to him, not as a threat, but as a human being, and to talk to him, and not to panic, and not to. And he ended up sitting at the end of her bed and talking to her for hours and leaving without hurting her. Now, I mean, that might not always happen, but it was again an example of somebody who was committed to virtue, and who faced a situation where virtue had to kick in and suggest different ways of responding than getting the gun out my drawer and shooting the person, because that's the only option. So I think that's how it fleshes out, really. It's a call to sort of creative responses that do actually believe that these virtues of Jesus matter and make a difference. So the kind of, last comment, the kind of shape that a Christian presence should be in society, I think, is one that actually does really creative things, because it's listening to a different drumbeat. And that's where creativity comes from. And there are wonderful examples of that. I mean, the whole Jubilee campaign to cancel third world debt, I mean, is an example of that sort of creativity that comes from determining to listen to a different drumbeat rather than being dominated by the logic of the world. Right, thank you very much for listening so carefully, and next week is the resurrection.